Welcome to Mansplaining, a podcast about the interesting things you can discover if you just take the time to learn. My name is Joe. I'm your host for this week. And as always, I'm joined by my college friend Mark. Together, we'll explore what's on our minds and hopefully figure out a thing or two about a thing or two. Mark, I guess I shouldn't be surprised about this since we cover so many topics that are in the news, but I remain kind of mind-boggled by how often I read in the paper about something we covered on mansplaining. And just yesterday, there was something in the paper about the Havana syndrome and how the U.S. government agencies have apparently concluded that Havana syndrome is not caused by hostile actors from foreign countries. And interestingly, one little tidbit in the middle of the article I read said that the reason they feel pretty secure about this not being hostile actors is because they were monitoring all the chatter, the intelligence agencies, and all the hostile actors, Cuba, China, Russia, were all talking about Havana syndrome like, wow, wonder what that is. And not us. Like, it must be a nefarious plot by the U.S. to kind of make us look bad on the world stage. And that's one of the reasons why the intelligence agencies don't think it's those countries. Anyway, did you catch that? I thought that was really interesting.
I did not. I will say that the people who feel like it was bad actors on the other side of things, one of their prevailing theories was that it was a rogue faction within Cuban intelligence. So it could be entirely possible for Cuban intelligence not to know what's going on at the same time that one of their own is attempting to do something along those lines. But yes. I personally don't think that we faked it in order to make Russia look bad. That seems like entirely too elaborate and well coordinated on our part to put over a hoax like that. But it is definitely an unexplained phenomenon. And unfortunately, people got very sick from something. And it's too bad that they might never have answers about it.
Right. Yeah. And for our listeners who don't know what Havana syndrome is or what we were just talking about, check out episode 39 of the podcast where Mark really explains it well. We recorded it about a year ago, but I think it stands up well based on the new information received this week. But on to today's topic, which is another controversy-laden topic in the news, critical race theory. I don't know what critical race theory is. I mean, I have an idea what it is, and I've heard a lot of explanations of what it isn't, but I feel like this is a term that cries out for mansplaining. So I asked you last time, Mark, to tell us what critical race theory is, and also why it's been such a political lightning rod in this country. I feel like it's kind of one of those bogeyman terms, like defund the police. So I asked you to look into that and let us know. What did you find?
Well, as always, thank you for the question. And critical race theory is, I'd say, one example of something we see too frequently lately. A word or phrase, and in fact, defund the police is a good example, which we covered back in episode 11 of this podcast. That gets taken out of context and used as a device to inspire outrage for purely political purposes.
Yes. That was my sense. So I'm glad to hear you confirm that.
And the fact that very few people today know what the phrase critical race theory actually means is part of that strategy. Because as history has demonstrated all too frequently, it's easy to take ignorance and turn it into fear and hate.
Right. In fact, that's the Republican Party's modus operandi, as far as I'm concerned.
It does seem to be in the wheelhouse of certain major players these days. So let's see if we can take a small step in the opposite direction today. Hopefully by the end of this episode, we'll have a better understanding of the term, and as a result, it will be more difficult for bad actors to manipulate us.
Good.
So let's get started. Critical race theory is a body of thought that first took shape in academic circles in the 1970s, partly as a response to and extension of a body of thought known as critical legal studies. Critical legal studies emerged in American colleges and universities in the 70s as a response to the dominant legal school of thought at the time, which was known as, quote, legal formalism, unquote. Legal formalism was an approach to the study of law that emphasized the importance of objective legal rules and principles, and viewed law as an autonomous and self-contained system that could be applied to any legal problem. As an example, you might think of the Ten Commandments. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. That's the law for anyone who worships the God of the Old Testament. It applies to every believer equally. It applies to every situation those believers might find themselves in. It means exactly the same today as it did 3,000 years ago. And the only question a judge or jury would need to ask is, did you break the law? Critical legal studies scholars didn't think that legal formalism was up to the task of understanding how law actually functions. And remember, this was the 1970s when America was just coming out of a period of radical social and political upheaval.
Right.
They saw the simplicity of legal formalism as inadequate to the task of understanding the ways in which law and legal institutions are shaped by social and economic forces, and how they can serve to reinforce existing power imbalances in society. As a result, critical legal studies scholars hoped to develop a more critical and socially conscious approach to legal theory that would expose the ideological biases of the law and ultimately promote social justice. So for our topic today, the core idea to take away from critical legal studies is the conviction that law and legal institutions can be biased and serve to reinforce existing power structures and social divisions.
Okay.
Critical race theory was an application of that same idea to the topic of race. It first took shape in the 1970s as a response to and critique of the civil rights movement and traditional views of racism. Critical race theory and critical legal studies are so closely related that one man, legal scholar Richard Delgado, was an important figure in the development of both movements. In addition to Delgado, important early thinkers in critical race theory included law professor and civil rights activist Derek Bell, civil rights activist Kimberly Crenshaw, and civil rights theorist and law professor Cheryl Harris. Their work was inspired by the frustration that resulted when civil rights legislation was passed in the 1960s, but racist practices and institutions endured. The civil rights movement succeeded in forcing blatant racism underground. For instance, you would no longer see drinking fountains labeled as for whites only, and businesses could no longer deny service to customers on the basis of their race. However, by the 1970s, it had become clear that there were more subtle power structures at work, often posing as neutral institutions in law and society that served to prop up the old pre-civil rights status quo. When we think of racism, we have a habit of assuming that it's an individual problem, the product of a person's upbringing, environment, and the education they received, and that the task at hand is to change the hearts and minds of the American people. For example, consider the recent film Green Book. The movie tells the story of two men, a black man and his white driver, who take a road trip through the American South. The white man initially holds a lot of ignorant, racist opinions, but his experiences on the trip force him to re-examine his beliefs, and the movie's happy ending shows him eating dinner as an invited guest at the home of the black man. And that's how we like to think about racism. That, sure, there are racist individuals out there, but we can make the world a better place by coming together and realizing that we're not so different after all. It was that point of view that led Green Book to win the Academy Award for Best Picture that year.
Right.
Critical race theory shifts the focus from racist people to racist institutions. It focuses on the ways that systemic and structural racism contribute to social inequality, and argues that racism and racially discriminatory outcomes are a product of laws and embedded institutions rather than solely a function of individual belief and action. A good example of this is the practice of redlining, which first emerged in the American housing market in the 1920s and became formalized with backing from the federal government the following decade. In 1935, a group of federally backed banks had a map of 239 U.S. cities created, with neighborhoods classified into 4 groups. Type A, the most desirable, were mostly affluent white suburbs. These were outlined in green on the map. Type B neighborhoods, designated as still desirable, were outlined in blue. Declining neighborhoods, designated Type C, were outlined in yellow, and Type D neighborhoods, the worst of the bunch, were outlined in red. If your place of residence was in a neighborhood outlined in red, good luck getting a home loan, because the banks designated the inhabitants of those neighborhoods as the most risky for mortgage support. And Joe, can you guess what type of neighborhood tended to be designated as type D?
Yes, inner city minority neighborhoods.
Yeah, they tended to be the older neighborhoods, the more rundown and decrepit ones, and they were in the center of cities. Now, it should be pointed out that overall, the residents of these neighborhoods were 85% white, but almost all urban black neighborhoods were designated as type D and redlined. Redlining may have not been racist in intent. There's nothing in writing that indicates the federal banks issued any directive that neighborhoods be redlined simply because of their racial demographics. It was, however, racist in practice because it prevented generations of non-Caucasian families from gaining equity in homeownership or making improvements to homes they already owned.
Yeah.
Community banks needed to follow federal guidelines to qualify for federal insurance, so the individual banker or loan officer didn't need to be racist for the lending outcomes to be racist. Redlining could produce racist effects no matter the personal convictions of the people involved.
Right, and I get that, and I offer this not to push back against that, but it occurs to me that redlining is also classist.
Yes.
Especially with your statistic that 85% of the people who were redlined were white. People who were poor. It's discrimination against the poor, maybe even more specifically than against black people per se.
Yeah, it was definitely a measure that took a hard toll on upward mobility in this country and served to target a number of groups, one of which happened to be black neighborhoods.
Right.
It wasn't until the Community Investment Act of 1977 that it became definitively illegal to redline neighborhoods. But some would argue that the spirit of redlining lives on to this day in single-family zoning laws that make it next to impossible to build affordable housing in majority white, affluent neighborhoods.
Yes, agreed. And that's a topic we should cover on mansplaining one of these days.
Yeah, it definitely hits home for me because Seattle is one of those cities where single-family zoning makes it difficult to increase density or build affordable housing.
Yes.
And there is progress in the city in the direction of changing those laws, but it's been very, very slow. Now, there's more to critical race theory than this. That school of thought tends to take those things about race and racism that you thought were pretty simple, and it demonstrates how subtle and complex those things actually can be. For instance, it examines the complex ways in which race intersects with other factors like class, gender, and sexuality to shape a variety of ways in which discrimination and oppression might be experienced depending on the individual identity of the person concerned. This is the concept of intersectionality, which you might have heard of before. Intersectionality calls out the ways in which a black woman's experience of racism can be different from that of a black man, and that both experiences may be different from the experience of a black gay man.
I want to make sure I understand intersectionality. It sounds like the way you're describing it, it's kind of like a Venn diagram of a person's various identities. So if you are black and male and gay, and all three of those constituencies are historically oppressed, on the Venn diagram, it's going to converge on a bunch of historically oppressed constituencies. And if you're in more than one of them, then that could explain why racism or sexism is particularly persistent for you as opposed to somebody else. Mm-hmm. Is that a fair assessment?
I think that's part of it. The experience of a woman who is black in this country is not just her experience of sexism. It's also blended with her experience of racism because there's a particular view of her as specifically a black woman.
And if she's poor on top of that,
yes,
it's her experience of classism. And if she's gay or trans, it's her experience of that on top of everything else.
Right. Yeah, so it's really a step away from the assertion that race explains everything, that race is one factor within structures of power and inequality in this country, and that it intersects with other similar categories in ways that are complex and that change and divide into distinct experiences depending on where you fall within that spectrum of difference.
Right. So I thought of it visually as like a Venn diagram might be a helpful way of understanding that, because to see the difference between, the conflict with second wave feminists who were mostly white middle class women and all the other women in the world, in the country, who were being discriminated against arguably even more. And if we could see visually that, oh, okay, this woman is black and poor and gay, in addition to being a woman,
mm-hmm.
that's extra reason why she was discriminated against. And you'd be able to see that visually if it were mapped like a Venn diagram, it seems to me.
Yeah, my reading might be a little bit off, but it's a slightly different from yours. That I would say, yes, there are times when sort of discrimination piles on top of itself and you're almost building a tower of inequality. You know, the black and the woman and the gay on top of that. So that's 3 times as bad. But also I think it's kind of a map of difference. That's a black trans woman and a black gay woman both experience inequality, but in different ways and in different scenarios. And so it's just adding distinct voices to the dialogue that we're having about race is probably the best way I can put it there.
Okay.
They're mapping differences of experience rather than this experience is inherently worse than that experience.
Right. Okay.
And at the center of all this is the idea that race is not biological, it's social. That is to say, you may be born with a certain color of skin, but the ways in which you were treated, both good and bad, are a function of social and cultural institutions. Race is a social construct, which means it's neither fixed nor objective, but is actually a fluid concept that changes over time and is shaped by a variety of forces. And attitudes to race are deeply embedded in the ways that we view the world, so much so that we're not always consciously aware of them. Critical race theory argues that racism is so much a part of everyday life that people, white or non-white, who may not intend to be racist, may still make choices that fuel racism.
Right.
And it argues that it's essential that we look at the ways in which power and privilege shape society and produce injustice. If a society's wealthy classes are almost exclusively white, and if those classes have almost exclusive access to lawmakers at the state and federal level, then we can expect our country's institutions to protect the privileges of those white, wealthy people.
Right.
Critical race theory has been used to explain and critique such issues as police brutality, mass incarceration, and education inequality. It critiques the healthcare system for granting unequal access to and quality of care through its policies and practices, and it critiques the education system for its role in reinforcing systemic racism through its curriculum, teaching methods, and hiring practices. It's worth reiterating here that critical race theory does not lay these outcomes at the feet of individual racist American doctors and educators. To the contrary, it argues that the fact that inner-city black schools tend to be awful and underfunded, and that they have failed entire generations of students who might otherwise have gone on to great things, is the result of systemic racism and inequality that are both complex and deeply embedded within our society and our institutions. And with that all as background, activists and scholars have used critical race theory as a framework for advocating on behalf of policies and practices that challenge and dismantle what they've called out as systems of oppression. Just to cite one example, they argue for the need to address systemic racism in the criminal justice system by, among other things, abolishing mandatory minimum sentencing and implementing community policing. As you noted in your question, though, critical race theory has become very controversial, especially lately among conservatives. For instance, our old friend, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, recently delivered a speech in which he warned that critical race theory teaches children to hate the police. As we record this, I'm not sure whether DeSantis actually knows what critical race theory is. I also don't know whether he cares what it actually is, but maybe we can update this episode if he demonstrates understanding or insight at some point in the future. At any rate, as far as I can tell, there are basically 4 critiques of critical race theory on the right. First, it is criticized as an attack upon traditional American values and institutions. The basic idea here seems to be that America is the land of individualism and opportunity. We're all supposed to have equal opportunity to live the American dream. Critical race theory, on the contrary, argues that certain segments of the American population are operating at a fundamental disadvantage and that our laws and institutions act to prevent them from realizing those dreams. To some conservative eyes, that makes critical race theory fundamentally un-American. They argue that it encourages us to look at the world through a racial lens, when in fact we're all just Americans, one nation under God. And so in 2020, then President Donald Trump issued an executive order banning the use of critical race theory in federal government training programs on the grounds that the theory promotes anti-American ideas.
Mm-hmm.
The second critique is related to the first, that critical race theory is divisive. It sets white Americans against everyone else and divides the country against itself. The Conservative Heritage Foundation has something to say on this topic. It says, quote, "When followed to its logical conclusion, critical race theory is destructive and rejects the fundamental ideas on which our constitutional republic is based," unquote. The Heritage Foundation, in fact, says that critical race theory is directly responsible for lots of things. I'm going to read you a list, Joe. See if you can guess which item or items are not on the Heritage Foundation's list.
Okay.
Are you ready?
Yeah.
Number 1, the Black Lives Matter protests. Number 2, LGBTQ clubs in schools. 3, diversity training programs. 4, the popularity of rap music. 5, ethnic studies curricula in schools. 6, free speech debates on college campuses. And 7, school shootings like the one at Parkland Elementary School. Which of those is not on the Heritage Foundation's list?
School shootings.
That is incorrect. The correct answer is rap music. To my knowledge, critical race theory has never been held accountable for that trend in pop music yet, but the Heritage Foundation does think that it's responsible for school shootings. The third critique is that critical race theory promotes a victim mentality within Black and other minority communities and fails to recognize the success of minority groups in overcoming oppression and achieving success. In short, this argument is that it sells minority communities short, that members of minority communities can succeed in modern America, and perhaps they might succeed more frequently if not for the victim mentality that critical race theory allegedly promotes. This argument in particular seems to me to be swimming upstream. You can make the argument that certain minority communities, Asian Americans for instance, are doing relatively well in America today by some measures, though some Asian Americans might have something to say about that. But you cannot argue from the available evidence that Black communities are thriving. Just look at education. When you correct for social class, there is a substantial achievement gap between Black Americans and other groups. They score lower on tests and are given lower grades than white, Asian, and Latino students. So while it's possible to cherry-pick individual success stories, you cannot in good conscience argue that Black America today is thriving, and I find it far-fetched that critical race theory itself caused this achievement gap simply by producing a victim mentality.
Yeah, and in fact, it sounds like CRT is an attempt to explain why the achievement gap exists in the first place.
Right.
So It's especially ridiculous to try to ban it from consideration in schools if it's an attempt to understand why these systemic inequalities exist.
Yeah. The fourth critique, and the final one, is where people start to get really angry, though. Namely, the claim that critical race theory advocates for discrimination against white people in order to achieve equity. In other words, this is the dreaded reverse racism charge. And the obvious example here is affirmative action, which, not coincidentally, is being challenged in 2 cases that are to be decided by the Supreme Court this year.
Yep.
Let's think about how a college or university admits students. They could go strictly by grade point average and standardized test scores. However, it can easily be argued that those are poor measures since the quality of education you get in high school can vary dramatically depending on where you grew up. If you were in an affluent suburb, property taxes brought plenty of funds into your school and you probably got a pretty good education.
And were able to afford expensive tutors on top of that.
Exactly.
So you can ace your tests.
If you grew up poor, Black, or both, your school was probably poorly funded, the teachers were underpaid and overwhelmed, and you probably got a pretty bad education, even if individually you were a good student. That's why most schools these days have affirmative action programs. In the interest of a social good, and in order to have a more diverse and representative population of students, they admit some students from marginalized communities whose test scores might be lower than students from more affluent communities. Is that reverse racism against white students, as many conservatives would argue, or is it a carefully considered attempt to compensate for disadvantages that those marginalized students have already suffered simply because they were born into the wrong communities? The Supreme Court rulings are expected this spring or early summer. Most people expect the court to roll back affirmative action to some extent. and the enemies of critical race theory will celebrate that outcome if, in fact, that's what happens. For the proponents of critical race theory, though, such a judgment would be an excellent example of laws and the courts being used to prop up privilege, which is exactly the thing that inspired the movement in the first place. Several states in the United States have passed laws or issued executive orders banning the teaching of critical race theory in public schools, arguing that the theory promotes a divisive and harmful agenda. And again, proponents of critical race theory argue that these efforts are part of a larger campaign to suppress discussions of race and racism in America and to undermine efforts to promote social justice and equity, all in the interest of protecting white privilege. In short, they argue that the various ways in which critical race theory is being taught today only offer further proof that critical race theory is exactly what this nation needs. I know where I stand in that debate, Joe, and I hope that I made that clear in the way I presented this story. What do you think?
Oh, I have a bunch of thoughts. I'll start with your last point about why the pushback against CRT. One thought I have is, what a bunch of snowflakes these conservative critics are, and it's especially galling that they accuse liberals and progressives all the time of wanting to police speech because we have our feelings hurt. But it seems like that's exactly what they're doing with all this legislation that is being introduced around the country to ban the teaching of CRT.
Oh, yeah.
That's my first reaction. But I have a question for you, because one thing I thought you might address that, unless I missed it, I didn't hear you address. So I want to put the question to you. One of the defenses of CRT is that it's taught only at the college level, but you'd never know that based on the right-wing freakout.
Sure.
You would think it was being pushed on kindergartners. Can you confirm that, in fact, critical race theory, as you explained it, is taught at the college level and above, and it isn't taught to young children?
It's kind of hard to prove in absence. It is definitely a college-level curriculum. That's where you would encounter it.
Right.
But I can't say for certain that no high school teacher has thought that this is a good discussion topic for his class.
Right.
I would say, though, that this is a good example of something that we saw also with the Don't Say Gay legislation in Florida, which is about prevention of discussion of homosexual lifestyles among primary school students, where almost certainly those discussions were not happening, but they can sort of float the topic there under the cover of protecting the children, which you're bulletproof if you have an argument for how to protect children.
Right.
But it's a way to slip something in where what you actually want to do is shut down the conversation at higher levels.
Right. And that's precisely how the Virginia governor got elected, Glenn Youngkin, who may run for president next year. The other thing, when we were talking about the Supreme Court and how I would also remind our listeners that a few years ago they gutted the Voting Rights Act, putting a target on affirmative action. And I wanted to say this, that it's almost like conservatives think American history started with Barack Obama's election, right? That's the elevation of this one guy kind of resets American race relations to a point of absolute equality.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Obama was president, so now we can be a colorblind society. Now, in fact, we are a colorblind society. And they seem oblivious to the deep structural inequalities that remain, which seems precisely what the point of critical race theory is, to kind of elucidate that, bring that to the surface.
Yeah, wishful thinking, I think, that if you can say, okay, we elected a black president and then reelected him, problem solved, we don't need to do anything else, it lets you off the hook from confronting the very many remaining tasks to be done.
Right. Which dovetails to your earlier point about personal racism versus institutional racism, right?
Yeah.
We don't need to talk about redlining, because this is really about bad individuals doing personal acts of racism.
Yeah.
Guns don't kill people, people kill people. It's a very similar argument.
Yeah. Yeah. And it reminds me of police brutality, where an individual cop is dismissed, but the brutality goes on because they're deeply embedded in training programs, in procedures, in sort of the ad hoc ways that cops connect with each other and support one another. And those things are much more difficult to root out than to fire an individual bad actor.
Yeah. Okay, here's another thing I want to run by you. I wonder, and I'm thinking now specifically of our defund the police conversation, and at the end, you and I tried to rebrand defund the police. Remember that? Because we were kind of convinced that it was a salient concept, but it was terribly presented by its advocates. And I'm wondering whether critical race theory is similar in that way, whether it's a term that freaks people out in its wording, right? Because it includes two scary terms, critical, which must mean we're angry, right?
Yeah, we're criticizing somebody.
Exactly. And race, which is the third rail of American life, right? So it freaks people out. But if you can get past the wording, it embodies a set of solid principles that we can all learn from, as I think you and I both feel strongly about that. So I wonder if it's a PR problem more than a substantive problem. What do you think about that?
I think that the term critical race theory is so opaque that it plays into the hands of people who are arguing in bad faith. Because if you don't know what critical race theory is, someone naming it to you is not going to inform you what it is. It's just going to seem like this thing, and so then they can tell you what it is. Oh, critical race theory is something that teaches kids to hate the police.
Right.
How would you know from just the title that that's incorrect? So I would argue on behalf of a much more explicit title, the study of the ways in which laws and institutions can embed racist attitudes and produce racist outcomes. It doesn't roll off the tongue, but it leaves much less room for misunderstanding.
Yes, yes. And to that point you were making about how the enemies of CRT kind of take it and run with the concept and paint it in a bad light, there is some malign intent here, clearly. And I came across something on Twitter, of all places, by Christopher Rufo, who's a right-wing gadfly and one of the main perpetrators of the anti-CRT, anti-defund the police movement, anti-Black Lives Matter. And this is a quote from Christopher Rufo on Twitter. "The goal is to have the public read something crazy in the newspaper and immediately think critical race theory." End quote, which basically proves what you were saying a minute ago.
Yeah.
They're trying to obfuscate, not to edify.
Yeah, create a bogeyman that's scary enough that you show up at the polls to vote against it.
Yeah.
I think that's the intent.
Yeah. There's one other thing I want to say, and I'm not sure how I feel about this, but it is a thought I had, so let me try to articulate this. It seems to me that there's a tension here between critical race theory advocates who believe race is a social construct, as I do, as any thinking person should, and then there's an element of racial solidarity inherent in their critique, inherent in their theory. So I kind of feel like you can't have it both ways, right? Like, I agree with a lot of the tenets of critical race theory as you just described it, but I'm sad at what appears to me to be a situation where relentless white racism has led to like this defensive posture by the critical race theory advocates, and they rally around the racial solidarity of Black people. It's totally understandable why they would do that, but it basically concedes the point that they're trying to argue. It kind of buys into the entire false narrative of race as this biological reality, which was a total fiction created by white people to serve their own purposes. So if you develop this defensive posture of racial solidarity to combat white racism, you're kind of buying into race as a biological reality, aren't you?
I think where I might differ is that saying that race is a social construct is not saying the same thing as that it doesn't exist. It definitely exists because it's something that appears in our lives just on a daily basis. And you and I are middle-class white people. We see race far less often than Black people do, for instance. Hispanic people do.
Right.
So it is both real and it is also an illusion in a way. There's a solidarity around experience. There's a solidarity around experience of victimization and racial profiling. And, if you've been stopped and frisked, there's an identity that goes with the sort of person who knows that that's something that you need to be afraid of every single day.
Right.
So I would say that the solidarity isn't just defensive. I think there's a solidarity of experience of oppression that is in many ways an appropriate response to what they've experienced.
Yeah.
And is also key to the sort of political action that is necessary for a change to happen.
Right. Yeah. So if I can rephrase what you were just saying, Black people have a lived reality of racism.
Mm-hmm.
Race is a social construct. It's fake. It's totally fake. But the problem is there's a majority of people in this country who don't understand that and think race is a real thing and make judgments based on that, which ends up oppressing people of color.
Yeah.
So race is a very real thing. Even though it's fake in the abstract, it's tangibly real because of people's ignorance.
Yeah.
I think that's what you were trying to say.
Yeah.
Right?
That essentially you could argue that race is not a real thing because it's socially constructed, but racism is a real thing that is experienced every day.
Yeah, right.
So did I answer your question?
Yes, you sure did. Thank you for an interesting conversation. I had a lot of thoughts lined up, but I couldn't find a good time to say a lot of them, so I dumped them all on you at the end. So my apologies for that.
Quite all right. Are you ready for the next question?
Yes.
Okay, so this question requires some background, so you're going to need to bear with me for a moment.
Okay.
There's a telecommunications company called Diamond Sports that was in the news recently. It owns a bunch of regional sports networks that have exclusive broadcasting rights to 42 professional teams, including teams in the NBA, Major League Baseball, and the NHL. If you're a local sports fan and you're watching a broadcast of your team's game that's not carried on one of the big national networks, that game is being carried by a regional sports network, either Diamond Sports or one of its competitors. As you might have heard, Diamond Sports is expected to declare bankruptcy. I've been hearing for years about the phenomenon of cord cutting, where consumers cancel their cable TV subscriptions because they're finding their entertainment somewhere else, maybe on YouTube or on social media or video games or on streaming channels that go directly to the consumer. Personally, I cut the cord about 15 years ago. So many people have now made the same decision that the bottom is dropping out of the cable TV market and the old big money deals don't really make sense anymore. I've been thinking about what this might mean for sports in this country. We've been living in boom times for professional sports. Franchise prices keep going up. The football team in Washington, formerly known as the Redskins, was recently valued at $5.6 billion. Top players command salaries of $30 to $40 million per year, and that money isn't coming from ticket sales. It's mostly coming from television deals.
Right.
But if the regional sports networks are drowning in debt from their current deals, presumably future deals will be for much less money. And ESPN, which is a major partner of all the pro sports leagues, is in a similar bind since its profits depend on dwindling cable carriage fees. So my question for you, Joe, is cord cutting a looming apocalypse for professional sports, or is it no big deal? Which leagues are in a good position going forward and which might really struggle?
Interesting. Well, I look forward to researching this one. I will admit right now, I am a person who was threatened to cut the cord for years, but still hasn't done it.
Right.
So I'll really be interested in researching this to see what the future holds in this area.
Okay. I look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Okay, folks. If you have any thoughts about this episode of Mansplaining, if you'd like to comment on this episode or any other one we've done, please go to our Facebook page, Mansplaining the Podcast. That's where you can like us, you can check our sources, you can leave a comment or question about what you just heard, and you can also suggest topics for future episodes. We like any and all of it. We love to get feedback. We appreciate anything you want to tell us there. We'd love to grow this audience, We have been growing the audience, but the more it grows, the happier we are. So the best way to do that is for you to give us a rating if you like what you just heard, or if there's another episode of the podcast that you really enjoyed. Mention that. Give us a rating. Give us a 5-star rating. Give us a positive review, whatever app you use to listen to this podcast. If you're so outraged from this episode that you would like to engage in doxing us, or canceling us, or pantsing us, or whatever other you're interested in doing to us, you can also do that on our Facebook page and by giving us ratings. Not so good ratings. We hope you don't do that, but...
Yeah. And for what it's worth, I'm already like 90% canceled already as it is. So you won't be having a big effect on the world if you cancel me. I'm just throwing that out there.
Yeah. And on that note, that's a wrap for this episode. That was Mark. I'm Joe, and we'll talk to you next time.
See you then. That's it for this edition of Mansplaining. Mansplaining is brought to you by Joe and Mark and nobody else. Thank you for hanging out with us for a little bit, and we'll see you next time.